Good evening, good morning, whatever it is for you in your section of the world. I am Cale Royer. I am not Lindsey Purcell. I'm Cale with Tree Stuff. We are here to start the webinar with Lindsey on pruning, and specifically looking at some of the Rate My Prune submissions that we've had on our social media, as well as our Rate My Prune contest and raffle that we have every month. If you don't know, we do Rate My Prune submissions where you can send your pictures of your before and after prune jobs to media@treestuff.com, and we put them up on our social media page for people to essentially thumbs up or thumbs down. And then we also do a monthly raffle on Tree Stuff. If you go to treestuff.com/ratemyprune, you can be a judge and judge for each month of people's before and after prune jobs. And just for judging, you are entered to win a $100 gift certificate to Tree Stuff that we will send out to a random person who has judged in that month. You can do this every single month, and I would expect you to. So the other thing that I have to talk about is that we have a couple promotions going on. So if you go to treestuff.com/and-then, you'll find a couple different promotions that we have that are kind of perennial things that we've started. These are if you buy a certain item, we will then email you later with a gift certificate. So maybe it's buy a zigzag, we'll email you with $50 off your next purchase. Or what is that? I think there's a Produce, and it's like $100 off of your next purchase of $300. Buy a GRCS, and you'll get a certain amount off of your next order. So go to treestuff.com/and-then to see what you can get just for purchasing the stuff that you need to purchase to run a business. To whomever said, I like a Treetopia shirt, thank you. Thank you very much. I ordered them. I did not make this design. Treetopia is our yearly event that we do out in California, climbing, training. Lindsey is one of the headlining trainers there. We do that with our best friends, our BFFs, A+ Tree Service, including Cassie, who is in the comment section. So if you have any questions about A+, or how to host the coolest party ever, you can ask her. She's on Facebook right now. I just saw her comments. So we have that going on. Keep an eye out for more news about that. The other only event that I have to talk about right now is we have a Tree Stuff party happening at the Purcell Technical Institute. That is January 8th from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. Yes, that's like a Wednesday or something, but it's also months away, so plan around it. It's a lot of fun. It's really cool. Nick Bonner's going to be there. Rudy and Kyle from Purcell are going to be there, as well as the Purcell Training Institute. There are free CEUs that you can get from attending a class. You can test out equipment that you may not usually have the ability to get your hands on and actually climb with while you're there, and also take a tour of their facilities. They are really cool. The Purcell facilities are really neat. There's a bunch of videos that we have on our YouTube channel of the Purcell facilities. I would suggest going and looking at those, and I would suggest also, if you're in the Salt Lake area, that you go and you actually attend that, because it's a lot of fun. You can meet a lot of other arborists. You can learn some stuff, and also check out kind of what it's like being inside of a world-class manufacturer's headquarters. So one more thing is that we are giving away Lindsey's new book. So make sure that if you are watching this, that you comment your name. If you're on Facebook, comment out there. If you're on YouTube, comment your name there. And we're going to pick one person to receive Lindsey's new book from the Facebook commenters and one from the YouTube commenters. Also, a shout out. Hi, Jambo Man. Robert Albritton is here. Number one best guy, just coolest guy ever. So if you know him, even if you don't know him, please contact him somehow. Give him a digital high five because he's the coolest. So comment your name, and you will be put into a raffle that we will announce the winners at the end of the webinar with Lindsey, and you can get his new book. So I think that's it. And with no more ado, that was a lot of ado. I'm sorry. Here is Lindsey Purcell.
Hey, Cale, good evening, and thank you everybody for taking time out to join us for this webinar on Rate My Prune. I want to thank Cale and Tree Stuff for giving me the opportunity to be on here once again with everybody. So this was kind of a neat concept. Rate My Prune is really a neat concept, and it's it's intoxicating to me because when I see it on Facebook, I can't ignore it. I try to, but I can't. Um, some of you that know me, pruning is my passion. I've studied it, researched it a lot, but worked with who I call the godfather of pruning, Dr. Ed Gilman, a good friend of mine down in Florida. And, I'm looking at these and I'm like, oh man, I really need to comment on that or say something. And so when they asked me about doing this, I said, hell yes, I'm going to do this. Because it gives me the opportunity to talk about what is basically what this presentation is what it is and what it's not. So this presentation is going to begin with some foundational pruning items that I believe will help anyone with their pruning skills. Also, this is an opportunity to address some pruning submissions, which again, I really love checking out on Facebook. But basically, the commentary is not based on my opinion, but mostly how the pruning that's been done follows best practices and research. So nothing personal here. And again, there's a lot of things we don't know or can see from just two pictures, the before and after. So there's a lot of little nuances there, but some of them are glaringly obvious. And when they talk about their objectives, I'm like, that's something that can be improved upon. So obviously there's some clear issues here with the observations that could be made, but I think we can learn something from this. So that's how we're going to roll today. And so I'm going to start out with just a few examples of some objectives. Um, and these are from submissions. So like the first one, the objective of pruning this tree was to reduce and raise the crown and cut dead branches. Okay, that's all good. And typical normal jargon for arborists. Next one, the purpose was to prune to lighten the tree. Now, I'm not sure how heavy trees are, but when we talk about lightening the tree, I'm guessing they're talking about thinning it and prevent it from falling over in the wind and make the tree small enough for cars to pass through. Well, that was confusing in itself, but we'll look at that one. It's just kind of a matter of how it was written. But you can see how that can be confusing. Next one was prune for shape, clearance, and crown cleaning. It was good. Then interior lower crown. I'm going to really jump into that. And then also like some limbs hang over the property, so we decided to crown reduce the tree. What I want to do is talk about how those are not current with best practices and standards, and give you some ways to maybe change your perspective on that. So what I found in most of the submissions was just inconsistent with the BMPs and standards, and a lot of misunderstanding on ways to effectively reduce load. A lot of guys in their objectives talks about reducing loads, and they're kind of misplacing their efforts, if you will. And I'm going to talk about what structural pruning is and what it's not through this process. And the problem with pruning interior branches, that's one that really lights me up. And just the inability to identify conditions of concern when you go to a tree in order to prune it based on a couple of things. And first of all, of course, conditions of concern. So this is why we're here. This is why you were called to come look at this tree. And there's two different perspectives. There's a perspective from the tree owner, tree manager, and there's a perspective from the arborist. And there's several conditions that can contribute to that weak architecture. And those things include like codominant branch or codominant stems, branches with poor aspect ratio. I'll talk about that. um, dead branches, the obvious things, bark inclusions, things that we know. So, and there's a lot of different scenarios here you can have for examples of conditions of concern for the owner and the arborist. But by and large, the majority of the things that we want to look at here are these items here: codominant stems. Obviously, we know what those are. It's where two basically double leaders in the tree. As you can see in this particular branch here, that's definitely not a good solid sustainable structure. Branches with large aspect ratio, and that's like this one you see here. That's with basically, it's codominant, but we call them large aspect ratio because the attachments are almost 1 to 1, and they should be half that. Those low aggressive growing branches, I'll point that out, and those aggressive vertical branches that come from lower in the crown and go up into the upper part of the crown and actually compete with the leader, creating more problems with that strong dominant stable structure from a central leader system. So when we talk about pruning objectives and practice and best practice. Basically, the standards say that no tree should be pruned without clear goals or objectives for the action. It's like, all right, once you get up in the tree, what am I doing? Hopefully you've done that before you actually put yourself into the crown, and actually know what you're wanting to do. What's the purpose for going up there, getting to work up in the tree, or getting out that pole saw or those hand pruners? There should be some clear objectives. And really there's two types of objectives. There's objectives for people, and there's objectives for trees. And based on the standards and best practices or the BMPs, the pruning objectives for people include very important things. First and foremost is mitigating risk, um, or pruning to improve structure, to make it more wind resistant, if you will. Pruning to provide clearance, pruning to manage size. When you say crown raise, we don't use those terms anymore. In fact, you won't even find that in the BMPs. Crown cleaning, you won't see that in the BMPs anymore. That's old jargon that we've got to change to match with the BMPs. And also using these objective-based statements gives us the opportunity to be a little more clear and provide clarity on what we want to do and what we expect out of our crews that are actually doing that. Of course, pruning to improve the view, pruning to improve appearance, all those things are certainly common objectives. Now, for the tree, here's what we're doing when we're actually pruning. And four very important things. First, as we prune, we're directing growth on young trees. We're changing where the resources are going, or what you've probably heard, a reallocation of resources. Um, Whichever branch is pruned is obviously going to grow slower than the one that is unpruned. And that's what we want to do. That's what forces growth in directions that we want it to actually grow. We're also managing load, especially on older trees. As we know, as trees get bigger, the parts get larger and the loads get larger as well on those attachments. And we'll look at that a little more closely. And then also providing clearance in what we like to call urban compatible trees. Oftentimes we inherit issues when it comes to trees in the built environment. They're too close to something with infrastructure conflicts and so forth. So we have to create clearance for people and pets and buildings and other things nearby. And certainly last but not least is improving appearance. I mean, obviously trees have an aesthetic functional quality as well, and we want to make sure the tree looks good for the tree owner. That's basically why, the main reason why people have trees, is because they provide some beauty to their and value to their landscape. But really the key to pruning is trying to apply the correct pruning amount, which is the pruning dose, on the correct branches in order to improve structure and also meet client objectives. So if I had to sum up the whole pruning process in one statement, I think this would be it. And this is what we should be trying to accomplish as we go to prune the tree, whether from a ground-based pruning operation or from a lift or from the rope. Now, one of the things we talk about a lot is managing loads, and this is a big deal because the majority of our failures that I've witnessed and experienced and see, especially in some of the failure databases, is basically wind loads. So we have two different types of loads. We have dynamic loads and static loads. Static loads is basically just the weight of the tree and gravity. So a branch, as I mentioned, as a branch gets bigger, gets larger, that means its load increases on that attachment as well. Now, a dynamic load is something like wind. And this is whenever it's dynamic, it's changing. Climbers are actually a dynamic load. Rigging is a dynamic load, as we well know. But through the pruning process, we either um, can improve that tree's ability to withstand loading forces, or we can destroy it. And it's basically up to you and how you prune. And this is one of the things that I've seen commonly happen in rate my prune submissions is we're not managing loads appropriately, and we're applying the pruning cuts in the wrong places. As we look at the force of the load, basically that trees and all the branches on it is dampening that wind energy. And as we're removing live green foliage, we're reducing that tree's ability to manage those loads in the process through the mass damping perspective. As I mentioned, most areas excessive wind is the primary cause of failures. And the thing is wind loads are kind of unpredictable in that they're periodic, and they produce kind of a complex sway motion in the tree. And wind is good for the tree, and the fact that as the tree moves under normal conditions, either in the breeze or just normal winds, it's actually stimulating that tree to put on additional wood fiber. If you look at a tree in the woods or in a protected area versus a tree, open grown tree, you'll notice that there's a difference in the shape of the tree, especially coming from the ground up. The taper looks different. But this is an example of dynamic response from the tree, especially from the loading. Now you see this codominant stem. I don't know if you guys are Weather Channel junkies, but I watch the weather all the time, and whenever I see, after a storm, we see tree failures. Like, yep, could have predicted that. Yep, could have told you that was going to happen. So a lot of times we see these conditions of concern or these defective areas, and we're like, it's not just a matter of if it's going to fail; it's a matter of when it's going to fail, such as this codominant stem. You can see the included bark, you can see the decay. And so it's just a matter of when that right amount of wind energy or that load exceeds the tree's capacity to carry that load. And that's based on tree strength. And tree strength has a lot of different variables. It depends on the species, basically the material strength of that wood, if the taper, any imperfections in that wood structure, and also the size of the parts as well. So there's a lot of things that go into that consideration. And as I mentioned just a couple slides earlier, though, one thing about a tree is it'll never grow anything it doesn't need. And by putting on additional wood fiber, all those leaves, this is what creates that damping effect. So if you watch a tree like this is just one that was in the backyard where I used to live, and I was watching this tree, and you look at the outer branches, and you can see that the leaves are actually, really going crazy, and you can see they actually even change shape. And what they're doing is they're reducing the drag on the tree so that it becomes more streamlined. And you can see the branches are moving, but as you move towards the interior of the tree, you can see the main stem and the trunk are barely moving. So basically you have a damping that's dissipating that energy from the leaf to the branch to the stem to the roots and down into the earth. So it's a really cool, complex system of how that tree dissipates wind energy. And all that is necessary for that tree to withstand that loading that the wind's creating. And I'm going to show you here shortly on what happens when you manipulate that tree's ability through pruning, especially improperly. So, of course, one of the things that's really, really bad for trees, as we know, is topping, obviously damage from weak attachments that are easily fail under excessive wind loading. Won't talk too much about that, and the fact that when we see this topping, you can see exactly where the cuts were made, and all of those branches above this area, this is where the tree was topped. So everything above that is basically sprouts. And as we know, those are weakly attached, and very little loading is required to actually disconnect them to the main stem, or its attachment. And that becomes a problem when it comes to failure and creating issues. Now, the next one of the most, probably the most damaging ways to prune is by removing these interior branches. And I hope that we all understand this term called lion's tailing. And this is where I see the majority of the mistakes made or misinterpretation of how to reduce loads in the tree from the submissions on Rate My Prune. So this is obviously a substandard pruning practice, and I'm seeing more and more of it. And I'm not sure why, but the problem, one of the biggest problems caused by lion's tailing is that it usually results in branches that grow long with poor taper. You're basically removing all the interior branches, and it shifts the future growth to the ends of the branches, which from a biomechanical perspective changes the center of mass of that crown. So the center of mass of a tree is identified as about 10% above the center of the tree. So if all the branches, if this was the crown and all of the branches were on there, center of mass would be right here, just about right in here. And so all of that wind energy that's hitting that has a more even distribution or dissipation of that wind energy through the entire crown. But now, because we've removed all of this lower interior um, leaf surface, we've shifted the center of mass up into here. So what that does is it increases the amount of force on these lever arms here. So now we have a huge movement of these branches, which creates additional loading or increased bending moment at the point of attachment. And foliage concentrated at the end of these branches are more prone to failure than those with the full crown. So again, this is one of the issues that I'm seeing more and more, and the fact that we're basically doing two things. One, we're reducing the amount of live green tissue that produces carbohydrates for the tree, but from a biomechanical perspective, we're also increasing the likelihood of failure for these trees. And that's where I see is one of the biggest problems. And I'll show you some examples of that here shortly. So when we're talking about prescription pruning, basically the sales arborist or whoever's looking at the tree is going to tell the crew or the producer where the cuts need to be made in order to meet the objectives. So we need to locate the target branches and then identify those cut locations to meet the objectives. So if we were to look at the tree, we want to look at basically the different areas of the tree that we'll talk about in the process. So exterior branches, as we know, is on the periphery of the crown. If we were to look at this large tree in front of you. Now we also have interior branches, and the importance of the interior branches, which I didn't mention earlier, is the fact that the outside or periphery of the crown, those exterior branches are typically newer leaves, current year's growth. Oftentimes during hot, dry conditions, they will shut down completely, close their stomates, and stop basically the process of photosynthesis and respiration. When that happens, the interior branches, though big, large shade leaves and those that have been on the tree for a while, actually do the majority of the work as far as biologically helping the tree. So by removing those interior branches, we're actually doing a biological disservice in the process. Then oftentimes we'll see these large branch whorls or clusters of branches. And oftentimes this is the remnants of what the tree looked like when it was first planted. And this is obviously lacks a central dominant leader system, which creates another biomechanical problem as well. Then also we look at branches with small aspect ratio. I'll talk or explain more about that here shortly. And then we look at branches that have the large aspect ratios in order to determine what really needs to be pruned once we get up into that tree. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we identify where that dominant leader system is. And on this tree, it goes up here. And then all of a sudden, it gets confused because we have multiple leaders here that will increase the likelihood of failure in that process. So go ahead, Kale.
I've got some questions before you get into the pruning zone here.
Sure.
So, first thing, did you talk about who you are when we started this?
I guess not. I make the assumption that if you've seen my face on Facebook, you probably know who I am. I guess I should introduce myself.
Everyone should know you.
Okay, well, I'm just so anxious to get into the meat of the subject.
I know.
I nerd out on this, as you can probably tell. But my name's Lindsey Purcell. I have been an educator. I recently retired a couple of years ago from teaching in the forestry department at Purdue University. Been in tree business all my life, even my family business. And after leaving Purdue, I wrote a book, which hopefully you've seen or will see more of, that actually kind of replaced the old arboriculture book that Dick Harris wrote almost 40 years ago now. But now I have my own consulting company. I do a lot of corporate training, do a lot of speaking, writing. You probably see my articles in TCIA and Arborist News, but enjoy working with tree stuff on a lot of projects, a certified arborist prep course. So a lot of my practice now, I've gone from climbing and actually working in trees so much as actually teaching about it. So thank you for that reminder, Kale.
Of course. And I wanted to do that to get into actually talking about your book. It should be available on Tree Stuff in the coming weeks. But yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what your new book is?
Yeah, it's arboricultural practices. It's a science-based approach. It's basically everything you need to know about taking care of trees. And there's 13 chapters in there that talk about pruning, a very extensive chapter on pruning. The foreword was written by Dr. Gilman. Very nice foreword. He mentored me through this whole book writing process that took about 2 years to do, roughly about 2,500 hours of literature reviews and research and writing, and relatively painful process at times. And you'll notice in the book there's a lot of incredible illustrations by my good friend Jeff Harris, who's an artist extraordinaire who can basically draw what I'm thinking, basically. And oftentimes I think there's close to 400 images in this book, so there's a lot of visuals in there. But it's a really good reference book and guidebook, textbook that I think you're going to find useful in your practice.
And if you put your name into the comments on Facebook or YouTube, you can win one at the end.
Yeah.
The other
and
thing,
also
yes.
One other thing, I'll give you a link to this later at the end of the program, but on Amazon, you can get a preview of some of the chapters of the book if you want to see a little bit about what it's like before you actually purchase it.
Oh, perfect. Yes. So what I forgot to talk about is the CEUs at the end of the webinar. I will post a link to a little quiz on Google Forms, 20 questions. If you get 16 or more of them right, then we will automatically send in your information to the ISA to get you free CEUs. Barry Bushaw, the name of the book is Arboricultural Practices, a Science-Based Approach. I have a couple questions. Hopefully we can get through these fast. Jocelyn Cohen, can Lindsay address some of the newer conversations about leaving stubs and how there is any validity to that on young trees where it makes the formation of wound wood difficult to form around the entire branch cut?
Yeah, that's I didn't put anything in here on that. I could speak a lot on, I think basically what we're talking about is heading cuts. And on smaller trees and branches, that's really not necessary. Basically what you're doing with heading cuts, especially on large trees, is we're trying to, they're reduction cuts to any kind of lateral and not necessarily a third of the size of the cut branch. But what that does is prevents us from making those large trunk cuts, large removal cuts that lead to decay. And the heading cuts on, especially on larger branches, usually we're looking at least 3 to 4 inch branches and sometimes larger. I got one at my house that had to do the same thing. And oftentimes you're criticized for making those heading cuts, but actually you're doing the right thing, and it's part of the standards and acceptable. But basically, it's a reduction cut that prevents removal cuts, which often leads to decay on larger trees.
All right, and then Ryan Redvers
Hey,
said
Ryan.
said sprouts aren't always actually weakly attached. I think sometimes strong, and is weakness from not from decay instead of the attachment.
Yeah, but sprouts, if they're managed properly, and I'll go through that a little bit. I've got one slide on storm response and basically storm and topping response. Sprouts are good. And oftentimes, if they're managed correctly, they can turn into decent attached branches, which can actually form branch collars. So that's a good point, Ryan, and the fact that, sprouts aren't always weakly attached, but they have to be managed so that they get the resources necessary in order to gain that more stable structure attachment to its origin.
I've got one here from some nerd named Nick Araya.
Oh
Uh,
gosh, I knew it. I knew he would be on here. Yeah.
he says common knowledge is that deciduous trees should be pruned when dormant so as not to waste energy or chlorophyll that the tree moves each winter. If you're trying to control and slow the growth, why wouldn't a heavy late summer pruning be a good idea?
Yeah, timing is everything, and it works for pruning as well. I'm not a big proponent of pruning during the dormant season unless, now here's my caveat, pathogen transfer is an issue. We're talking about oak wilt and things like that, bacterial diseases, anything that affects the conductive system from a pathogen standpoint. And research corroborates this in the fact that the best time to prune is when the parenchyma cells are active, so that the tree can start the compartmentalization process as quickly as possible to occlude that wound. But based on the timing, immediately after spring flush, you can get control growth. In late summer, when the temperate zone, especially, the later you prune, the more chance you run into proliferation of growth that may not harden off before winter weather, and you can get some dieback as a result of that. But that's a whole talk in itself, Kale. Nick, you and I'll have to have a beer and talk about this.
Um, last one for right now. John C. Olay said, "Is it good practice to leave epicormic growth around wound to help with sealing?"
Yeah, whenever you've got and that's especially important on heading cuts. I'll prune back to even a 2 or 3 sprouts, and oftentimes because of that truncated branch, you'll get a lot of dormant latent buds that will actually produce little branches, which brings resources to that cut area and can actually help improve that closure more effectively and more expediently.
Great. All right. Now that I
Carry on.
have totally sidetracked you, let's head back onto the pruning zone.
All right, man. Thanks. Great questions. Thank you. So the pruning zone obviously is here, and basically no pruning should occur in the interior of the tree unless you have, some what I call um, not tree friendly branches or non-beneficial plant parts, such as crossing branches, broken branches, things like that. Um, but everything should be occurring on the periphery of the tree. If we don't do this, then this is when we get this. This is when we get the lion's tailing. And again, this is a biomechanical nightmare for the tree. Shifting the load, increasing the likelihood of failure, reducing the damping effect, reducing the ability to produce the carbohydrates that are necessary to produce the simple sugars for the tree to survive. So those this is so important, and I'll show you some examples of those here shortly. Now, next is we talked about as common tree-based objectives is we want to locate branches to prune that has a poor branch aspect ratio. And what we're talking about here is as far as branch aspect ratio, it's one of the best predictors actually for potential for failure. Strong branch unions are those that are considered to have the proper aspect ratio. And what this is the diameter of the branch relative to the diameter of the trunk or stem or its point of origin, such as the parent branch or first order branch going to the second order branch. So branches with a small aspect ratio, as you see here in the image, are better attached to the trunk or to the limb. And those with a large aspect ratio, such as a 1-to-1, are those that have a increased likelihood of failure. So when we look at these branch aspect ratios, the ones that are stronger unions are those that are basically 2-to-1, whereas we have the parent branch or stem should be twice the size of the successive branch. Ideally, if we were to build the perfect AI tree, the trunk would be one size, the next branch would be half that, the first order branch. The second order branch coming off of that would be half that size. The third order branch would be half that size. That is what we would consider the perfect stable structure from a biomechanical perspective. So these are the branches that we really need to leave alone and focus on those with large ratios, such as you see here in the bottom left. So especially those V-shaped bifurcations. So anytime we have that 1-to-1 ratio, research has proven time and again here over the past few years that these have a higher likelihood of failure. And the ones with the large ratios should be either reduced or removed depending upon your objectives and the size of the branch and the tree and some other parameters there. So what we're looking at, obviously is for stems or trunks, we're looking at codominance. And this is oftentimes we get included bark in the branch union, and they're significantly more weaker than if they have a single leader or we have a smaller diameter branch that originates. So you can see if this is our main trunk, now we've got this codominant, this bifurcation here. So one of these should be reduced or removed depending upon the size of the tree, health of the tree, and so forth. Now you can see here, this would be example of a good aspect ratio though. So these two branches, by the way, these are Jeff Harris illustrations, which are wonderful to work with. But you can see that this branch here is half the size of its origin. So that's a strong connection as opposed to if this was the same size as the original stem or branch or trunk, which leads to problems. So we've also learned too that, and I can remember pruning, once I go up there looking for these poor attachments, we've been taught that basically anything that's codominant is a problem. But we've learned, if you've been watching the research, especially from Dr. Slater at Myerscough College, that not all bifurcations or codominants are alike. Um, Basically, what we see is it's about the presence of one thing. There's one thing that makes a difference in these two. What do we see in the picture on the right that's not on the left? And the answer is a branch bark ridge. This is what keeps that tree basically connected, those branches connected. So when I see branches that have a V-shaped bifurcation, I will reduce or remove those. When I see a U-shaped bifurcation or a cup-shaped bifurcation, as you see on the right, I may move on past that. So what that does is, by learning this, it's reducing the amount of cuts, which is better for the tree. But it's also making you more efficient and faster at your work, because you're not, I mean, used to, if I saw any of those, I'm up there pruning, removing, or reducing, and I cut a lot more than I actually needed to. So that research has helped tremendously as far as my decision making when I go up into the tree and determining on which cuts I need to make, because it all contributes to the amount of live green tissue that you're removing from that tree as far as the pruning goes. Now, last thing I want to look at as far as important things to consider from a tree perspective, objectives, is multiple leaders. And you can see this is what we often see, is this cluster of branches that occurs. And this is basically what the tree looked like when it was planted. And unfortunately, the dominant leader was not selected. The dominant leader should be here, but as a result of these competing branches through here, and this really tight cluster of branches, basically what happens is the center is going to die out as a result. And this is what we oftentimes see in this process. We'll see this. You can see this looks like a healthy tree growing, but all of a sudden you see this center part of the crown just start dying back, and that's often the result of that combination of all of those multiple leaders and branches in that cluster. And what happens is, basically, the xylem vessels, or mass flow, is reduced or cut off to the leader because of those competing branches. So we see a mess like this all the time, especially on a lot of maples. Um, we'll see this huge cluster of branches, and then as the tree gets bigger and as its branches get larger, they start basically squeezing each other out, shutting those xylem vessels down. So that mass flow is blocked or intercepted. The dominant leader begins to decline, and we actually get a loss of that central leader, which increases that likelihood of failure. So those are the key things. And when I think about it, it's like, how did we get here? How did this happen? And unfortunately, as I can't go anywhere without looking at the trees and mentally pruning them, and trying to figure out what we could do to make it better. And really, what I'd like to say is that the landscape industry, the guys planting the trees, and the ones maintaining them at this size that you see here, actually have a greater impact than we do on the future sustainability of that tree. So oftentimes we get this, they're selling this part, they're selling the crown. And you can see this cluster of growth. This is going to be a problem for these trees later on as they get bigger and they start squeezing out and competing for resources. So just a few well-intentioned cuts in the first 5 to 7 years of that tree's life can make a huge difference. On we're called in to clean up the mess, and it basically affects some changes to help create a longer lived tree. But if you can do this while the tree's young, wounds are smaller, trees more vigorously growing and able to compartmentalize those issues. So when we look at and that comes from one thing that we don't teach enough, is identifying the difference between temporary and permanent branches. It could easily be said that if you look at the tree on the right here or on the left, a newly planted tree has no permanent branches. Basically, they're all temporary. But as the tree grows, the top third of that tree become the permanent branches. So in the process of nurturing that tree to develop that strong structure, we want to shorten or reduce the lower branches in order to, again, reallocate those resources to the top of the crown and the branches we want to keep. So making that distinction between, you think about a tree as you walk by a newly planted tree, you're thinking, if I prune that to where it needs to be for clearance, this not basically not going to have any branches left. So we need to think about that tree as it grows in 5 to 10 years, where the temporary versus the permanent branches are located. Then as a tree matures, this is where we start thinking about creating that tree's permanent branches and creating that strong dominant leader system. And as the tree gets bigger, we need to increase our prune to improve clearance. Those we're going to, because we shortened or reduced those lower temporary branches, we can make a removal cut that's going to be smaller, because by pruning that temporary branch early in its life, it slowed it down. So it's not going to be a big 3-inch cut when we need to make that pruning cut to allow people to walk by or cars to pass through. Again, we've been proactively shifting growth or redirecting growth up into the crown, which is going to make a huge difference in the size of cut or size of wound that we have to create later on in that tree to meet the objectives, especially for clearance. So when we put all those together, again, we want to think about nurturing that tree from planting, early establishment, to medium aged and mature trees. And that begins at planting. So creating that tree form actually begins at installation. And it would be great if we could get this word out to our guys that are planting these trees and maintaining these smaller trees, because again, they can have the greatest impact on this process. All right, let's move on. So again, our whole idea is to encourage that dominant leader system. As you see here on the left, choose a leader. It's not always easy. It's not always perfect like this, but we want to choose that dominant leader, get good branch aspect ratio, and make sure we recognize where the temporary branches are versus the permanent branches. This is a good example. This branch is actually too low, and look how large they are. Now, and there are also this aggressive vertical branches, which are competing with a potential leader up here. If we'd have shortened this branch at planting, it would have been much smaller, redirecting growth here. So this tree is a great candidate for some good structural pruning, but it's going to require more pruning cuts and more aggressive cuts or removal cuts on the trunk. Okay, we got any questions?
Get it ready. Yes, we've got a couple questions here. I'm trying to narrow them down. Um, so a lot of these are about the basic kind of pruning loads that we're talking about. So, for instance, how much should we reduce on codominant leaders at one time?
Hmm.
Um, but then we're also building off of that into asking, shouldn't both leaders be reduced, not leaving one untouched in context of one-to-one with bark inclusion, and just kind of talking about what the, or I guess asking what the main opinions are and the best practices are for uh, the size of reduction that you can do.
Yeah, gosh, I'd love to be. That's a whole different presentation, but
Yes.
I can really quickly go through. For example, well, here's a codominant. I think we can all agree that this is a codominant stem. So the leader starts here, and then all of a sudden, we got two guys competing for the same job. Now we need to choose a leader here. Now, typically, our leaders, when it creates that fork or bifurcation, we want to choose, our parameters are choosing hopefully the one that's most vertical, but as we all know, that isn't always the case. So we look for the one that has the healthiest growth, better branch spacing up in here, and less problems as far as clusters and poor aspect ratio. So let's say we're going to choose this branch here as our leader. So it would go all the way up through here. So based on the size and vigor of that tree, we would then either reduce to a lateral here, or we may choose to remove this branch and just completely get rid of that. Now, it depends on pruning sessions and your client. So you may have just one shot to go in there and take care of this tree. This tree is going to fail. As I said, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So by reducing or removing one side of that codominant, we basically reduce the likelihood of failure by half. And that's not certainly a steadfast number, but obviously when the tree's going to fail, it's going to fail at that split. So depending upon the health and vigor of the tree, we look at the terminal buds to see what the incremental growth is. If the tree's got a lot of good spacing between the annual growth, it's like, all right, man, we can get a little more aggressive with this. But if there's short increments, like, ugh, dude, you're not doing so well. Maybe I need to be less aggressive and tell Mrs. Smith, the tree owner, it's like, look, I'd really like to get this down to prevent it from splitting, but I don't want to prune too much because it could put too much stress on the tree. So how about if I come back in a year or two and just successionally take that branch down to a removal cut? So a lot of it depends on the health and condition and objectives. But if you got one shot, get as much as you can. And by reducing this, we're shifting that growth here, which is where we want it on this side. So that's the key. Anytime we reduce, we're moving the resources somewhere else more favorable. If we remove it, even better.
So you're reducing that, and so that leader that you've chosen now is becoming stronger and is less vulnerable.
You got it, man.
Perfect. Michael Gregoire is asking, what about cabling?
Hey, tree support systems are certainly a good option, but they have to be good candidates. And if you can accomplish it through pruning without making large cuts or too many cuts or cuts which will stress the tree, do the pruning. Now, in larger trees where you have to make large cuts and pruning isn't quite an option, certainly if it's a good candidate, which means you have proper sized branches, there's no decay in those branches, then you can certainly do either static or dynamic cabling, and of course bracing if necessary. But once again, if you do that, remember that the client, the tree owner, is married to that system. And as a result, they have to be educated on what the requirements are for managing a tree with support systems in it, from ground-based inspections, aerial inspections, moving those on a regular basis as the tree grows. So it's a good option, but it requires a specific set of parameters in order for that to really be effective.
I have one question here, kind of a question that I've come up with. Is there, because we talk about usually your 1/3 rule on branches, is there a rule, or does that translate into the amount of foliage that is actually removed in a pruning dose?
Yeah, we were looking at the 1/3 lateral rule. We're basically making sure that whatever branch we prune down, let's say we're making, well, let's go back to our other tree here that I've all jacked up here with this. But when we remove to a lateral, we want to make sure that basically the branch left behind is big enough and has enough resources in the form of photosynthetic array and which are leaves to actually support that branch. Now, when you cut it back to a little tiny branch that's, from a 3-inch branch, 4-inch branch, there's not enough resources there to keep that branch alive. So again, that's why we say the 1/3. It doesn't have to be exactly that, and I don't think anybody tries to accomplish that, but it's got to be big enough to assume the terminal role. That's the guideline there, Kale.
Perfect. All right, I will keep recording questions in here, and we can get more a little bit later.
All right. With no more, as you say, further ado, we're going to look at some of these pruning jobs, and there's a lot of them. I can't get through all of them, but I picked a few of them that I thought were very helpful. So the objective of this one that was to reduce and raise the crown to cut dead branches. Of course, dead branches are always important in that process. But again, one of the one of the issues with clearance here, and one thing I like is, I know that you guys probably don't watch this anymore, but I remember watching Andy Griffith. I don't know. Does anybody watch that anymore? Caleb, have you seen the show at all? Okay. Remember Floyd the barber? Andy goes in, he says, Andy the sheriff goes in, he says, Floyd, I want a haircut, but I don't want it to look like I had a haircut. That's the way I approach pruning, in the same way. And this is one of those situations where they accomplished the objectives was basically raise the crown or pruning to improve clearance and remove dead branches. But you really can't tell that they did much, but they improved the situation there to make it more urban compatible. Now you can see where there's a lot of vertical branches here, kind of see that. And that's an inherited problem because in order to really get good clearance, you should have made removal cuts on the trunk and elevate that crown. But you can see all those temporary branches have now grown into big branches and they're permanent now. So basically what we're doing is not removing the first order branch, we're removing the second order branch and allowing that vertical branch to compete with the leader in the crown. So that's a problem that we often inherit. And we have to remove second order branches in order to improve that clearance or make huge reduction cuts, which is going to compromise the health of that tree. All right, let's look at another one here. So this was a full restoration prune by reducing all the dead tips to suitable laterals, with the majority of the cuts falling into 2 to 3 inch range. And again, this is one of those things where had I not seen the dead branches, I would think, oh crap, they just really topped that tree. But what they did was basically cut past the dead and created a tree that got rid of all the dead branches there. But again, you can see there's one problem here is there's multiple leaders in this system, and these were all temporary branches actually, and multiple leaders in this system. So one the tree's going to be fine at at this size, but where we run into problems is like after a few years, as that tree incrementally grows and the crown gets above the protective factors of redirecting that wind over and around the house, which shifts it up over the tree. But once that tree gets up into that no man's land and it starts experiencing different wind loads, that's when we can expect an increased likelihood of failure. And that's where we're going to have problems. But again, we inherit those issues and we have to do the best we can to structurally prune it and still accomplish the client's objectives in this process. But, this is one of those where it's all you could do and a good job doing it. All right, this was one that was a little confusing to me, and one of those things that I see, I think you're going to recognize is problematic. So the purpose of the tree was to lighten it, and based on the after picture, that means crown cleaning. Crown cleaning is it shouldn't even be in your vocabulary anymore. Crown cleaning should be replaced with structural pruning. By structural pruning, we're actually clearing the crown of non-beneficial plant parts and improving branch structure. And also, obviously, they want to reduce the likelihood of failure from this statement and make the tree small enough for cars to pass. And I'm guessing that's pruning to improve clearance, basically. So this is the after. Now, this is this is where I go a little bit insane. And when I see that they've removed a ton of interior foliage, completely unnecessary. The pruning again was not on the periphery of the tree. So if you're going to lighten the tree or reduce the load on those branches, you have to prune out here, not in here. All you did was remove the shade leaves, which are so important for the health of the tree under challenging, stressful environmental conditions. And you've basically reduced its biomechanical advantage as far as dampening from wind loads. So again, stay out of the center of the tree. And I don't see any pruning cuts on the outside here, or very few. So again, this is the problem. It shouldn't look this open. And there's no research that supports opening the crown to allow wind through because there's nothing there. It's been proven time and again by various researchers, Gilman, one of them, Ken James, another, that shows that it needs that live green tissue to dampen that wind energy. So this is basically increase the likelihood of failure as a result of reducing that biomechanical advantage of damping. All right, this one was a little more challenging. Great one to look at. So oak reduction. So this comes right from the submission. The council gave permission to pretty much pollard it. No idea why. That would be my response as well. They just drew a big circle around the middle of it and said, cut there. Well, it sounds like the council is trying to play arborist, and they know not average people can't be great arborists as ourselves. The tree has a preservation order on it too, so that means it's an important tree. So they want to make sure that it stays healthy and nice. So I decided to reduce it instead. Okay, if it needed it. I did pretty much the whole tree with a silky and a secateurs. So basically a hand saw and a hand pruner. That tells me that there was a lot of what I call fluffy pruning and reduced it, unless there were large aspect ratio branches or a clearance issue or likelihood of failure because of bad branch attachments. Why reduce it? And when I see this silky and secateurs, that does mean that no large branches were cut, which might be fine. But this is a picture before, and again, there's kind of sometimes hard to tell what's going on. And you can see here's this is what we focus on. So our this is a multiple or dominant, two dominant or co-dominant leaders, as you can see from where it was. I can't see the bottom of it, but obviously that looks like a co-dominant. But if this we were to treat this as a single leader, this is what we call large aspect ratio right here. This is a 1-to-1. So we've got has a higher likelihood of failure. Same here. These are our problem areas here and here. Now, in order to, if we were going to say, all right, our leader is going to go up through here, in order to make that work, we need to be reducing the weight out here, not in here. So we need to be cutting off some of these branches here, here, or even down here. So, and same with this one, we've got a huge load on this attachment. So this is our weak attachment right here. Now, what we should be doing is choosing a single first order branch to assume that main role. So we would reduce up in here and here in order to allow this branch to get stronger. So again, everything's occurring on the outside. All the pruning should be out out past this area, into this area. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. So basically, they removed all the interior branches, but you can see one thing that's still there is the large aspect ratio branches. The load wasn't reduced, just the green tissue was reduced, which isn't doing the tree any good service here. So actually what should have been done is reducing out these branches out here, because these are the ones that are going to fail. By reducing one, we're sending energy to the other. And we're also reducing the load on that poor attachment. There's several of them, 1-to-1 here, 1-to-1 here, 1-to-1 here. They're everywhere as far as the large aspect ratio. So again, this is another one where the interior branches were pruned and really didn't help the load. It just reduced the amount of live green tissue that tree has to survive on. Okay, anything pop up right now, Kale?
Oh yeah. So, I've got one here that's interesting from Michael Gregoire. What about interior crossing or interfering limbs?
Yeah, if you got crossing branches where it's, wounding the tree and rubbing back and forth, absolutely. That's a structural issue that needs to be taken care of. But if your goal is to make reduction cuts to reduce load on the attachment, you've got to prune out here in order to reduce that load. Pruning all this stuff inside here is not going to do any good at all. So, yeah, non-beneficial plant parts include broken hanging limbs, um, 1-to-1 ratio co-dominance, and also crossing or rubbing branches. That's certainly good practice there.
I've got John Olay asking how autonomous is each branch on a tree? For example, if you remove a codominant stem, how quickly does the other leader get the nutrients and growth benefits?
Immediately. I mean, I've got time-lapsed pictures of where I have pruned on Purdue campus. I've taken removal cuts on codominants, and what happens is when you open up one side of the tree, all those dormant latent buds that are growing on that tree that's recently been exposed to new sunlight and also getting new resources, you'll start seeing little branches starting to poke out. And any branches that were interior competing with the codominant are going to start getting more energy and they'll start filling in that area. So it takes time, and sometimes that tree looks darn wonky. But again, it takes educating the client in the fact that, look, I saved this tree from splitting, and not a matter of if, it's when. And by doing this, yeah, it's going to look a little weird for a while, but it's going to recover. And just try to be as informative and transparent as you can with that.
Talking about the rubbing points, Ryan Redverse says that. Oh, someone just posted and I lost the comment. Here we go. Duncan Slater says, "Be careful of removing rubbing points in mature trees." Is that something that you've seen is a problem?
Well, if it depends on how much damage it's doing. Like in some situations, especially on large mature trees or veteran trees, if you get those crossing branches, oftentimes they will fuse together and create they call a natural brace, which is actually beneficial for the tree. So, obviously that's very situational. As the tree's younger, we want to get rid of those. But if you inherit a situation where they're crossing on, you're looking at 4, 6, 8-inch branches crossing each other. We certainly don't want to remove those. Good reminder there, Ryan. And let them brace. Let them. Sometimes they'll even fuse, and you got that natural bracing system, which is favorable for the tree.
All right. Well, you just answered my next question.
Cool.
So I'm good to go whenever you are.
All right. So here's the next one. The objective for this oak was to prune for shape, clearance, and crown cleaning. The good part about that statement is it did say clearance. The bad part about that statement is it's not a shrub. We don't shape trees. Basically, that's for shearing. That's for shaping, little shrubby things. Crown cleaning, again, as I mentioned, isn't even in the BMPs anymore. It's not even a term. If we're crown cleaning, that means uh, we're basically removing branches that we don't need to. Now, if we're pruning to reduce risk, that means removing dead branches. But crown cleaning can be kind of a confusing term to people, and how they use it. So that, not that you're doing the wrong thing, but you might be saying it wrong and not being current with the new terms that we're using now in the standard. So, but the shaping's the big thing. And this is what I'm saying. This looks like it was sheared with the head shears. This really didn't do anything as far as helping the tree. This is actually a form of topping. So it's basically all the tree work was done on the perimeter, but it was that fluffy pruning, and I, maintaining this shape is going to be nearly impossible, unless the client just loves seeing you come and shave their tree every year. But again, trees have a natural shape and it should be allowed to grow, the freedom to grow. Hopefully it has the space to grow, and it looks like it does here. I understand that from it needed clearance, obviously below ground or from ground up to the first branch. And that looks like that was accomplished, but the rest of it is really just didn't do anything for the tree. Fortunately, that's the crime there, is the fact that it was pruned without really any consideration to actually benefiting the tree biomechanically. Back to crown cleaning. Um, in fact, that term isn't even clean. Is actually, if you look at the new BMPs, clean is used. That term is used twice in the BMPs. One, when it talks about cleaning tools after pruning, and the other one is clean in the glossary, where it's an arboricultural term used to describe selective pruning to remove one or more of the following: dead, diseased, and broken branches. So that's the only thing that really should fall under that term of cleaning. So hopefully that was what was accomplished in that process. So you can see this shearing effect here, which again doesn't really contribute to the benefit of that tree biomechanically at all. All right, so this is another one. Here is the objective statement. Tree was rather large for the size of the garden, but loves his big tree in the center of his garden. The tree had some overextended lower side limbs that were out of balance and had some limbs hanging over his property. So we decided to reduce the crown of the tree a half a meter off the height. I'm not sure why. Again, there is nothing above it. Why make pruning cuts if we don't need to? And 1.5 meter off the sides. So again, what we have here is basically topping. It's shearing the tree. There's no only thing that really the only real true objective here was reducing a perhaps dangerous limb or an infrastructure conflict over the house or the structure itself. The rest of it, absolutely unnecessary and not really if have creating any improvement or advantages biomechanically for that tree. Again, once if we're pruning live green tissue, you better have a good reason, and that's typically to improve structure, large aspect ratio, reducing competing leaders, those types of things that have an impact on structural stability. That's the goal there in that process. So you can see multiple leaders here. Can't do anything about that. I get it. But you can see there's a lot of large aspect ratio attachments in this area here. And here you can see a big one here where there could have been some reduction pruning in order to improve the stability of those branches. And also another thing I'll say too, whenever you see branches that are if you're going to prune branches that have poor aspect ratio, like a 1-to-1 ratio, we want to make sure that we prune the one that is most vertical growing. Branches that have a vertical orientation are much more likely to fail than those with a horizontal orientation. And it basically speaks to the elasticity of the branch and and the material properties of that branch under wind loading. So whenever you're pruning two branches, if this is a branch here, my fingers here, we want to take this one. Whoops, I shouldn't do that. We want to take the lower one so that we have that horizontal growing branch. Um, I need to practice on my demonstrations here. All right, I think this is, I got one or two more here, Kale. So this one was thin the interior lower crown. Thinning, not a good term, not good for the tree. Removing deadwood, good. Extensive end weight reduction. Now we're talking about the biomechanical aspects of this on the overburdened side. So we got kind of a misshapen crown here, and that's cool. You can shape it to get a more balanced effect, or some people may like the asymmetry of that tree as it grows naturally. Um, it on the lopsided tree, just the tips to avoid making any large cups on the interior laterals. That's what you like to hear. And preserve the tree as long as possible. So as you can see here, the before and after, it's a haircut, but it doesn't look like it got one. So again, this is as long as you accomplish the objectives, which were removing dead wood, now thinning the interior crown. Hope it doesn't look like there was too much of that done. But again, removing the tips communicates to me that they're pruning on the periphery and trying not to make any large removal cuts on the interior laterals, on the larger limbs, and on the trunk. So that's what I would call a good pruning, and the fact that the only problem here is just the communication and using the right jargon there. Now we got one for the landscapers. I'm glad Kale sent me this one. This is kind of the odd duck here, but we often get called for this as well. And what do you do with this? So oftentimes we're called in to prune because there's a big structural issue, and you can see obviously that these two look like junipers here are trying to eat the front door and close in. What do you do with this? Well, again, there's not a lot you can do because, as we know with evergreens, once you remove evergreen branches, they're not going to grow back. But what they did was actually pretty creative. What it almost looks like is like a bonsai treatment, and it actually works pretty well with that house and with the design of it. So it's a really cool cool way to mitigate the issue here without saying, ah, man, you just need to cut those things down. But obviously, with that type of pruning, though, you're going to expect a proliferation of growth in response to a lot of removal. So it's going to require maybe some extra maintenance. But at least it was a what I consider, in my opinion, this was a pretty good solution here. So nice work on that one. Okay, I think I got one. Oh, I got a couple more. How much time do we have, Kale? Okay. So this is one where the tree was about to split and hit the house. The homeowner wanted to take it down. I told him I could do a weight reduction surgery and it would be fine. It's still standing today, looking pretty. I know they're the cockroach of the tree world, but I was very good at trimming Bradford pears. Oh, Bradford pears. I actually like them. Too bad they're an invasive species. Yeah, that is the case. They are beautiful blooming trees. They stink like crap, but there again, they've been inherently have bad branching. So this is what it looked like, and I'm sure that's just a great seed source for invading all the natural ecosystem around it. And this is what it ended up looking. So again, I think probably the best prescription for pruning this would be a basal cut right above ground level. But they want to keep the tree. Again, what I probably would have done here is instead of shearing it, topping it, because now you're going to get a ton of growth on the ends of these branches. What I would probably have done is to reduced a lot of branches to create better clearance here and also reduce some of the weight or the load on those poor attachments with which ornamental pears are notorious for. So could have been attacked a little differently rather than shearing. Not the ideal prescription for this particular tree, especially another tree that's like this too is a lot of our hybrid elms have and zelkovas have this very similar growth habit where you got these multiple leaders just all scrunched in there together. And eventually, we've got a ton of them that's been planted about 30, 25 years ago on Purdue campus. And as they're getting bigger, they're starting to die out in the center. And we're wondering why. Well, I can tell you it's because you got that multiple leader system just squeezing out the dominant leader or choosing branches that to be the leaders in the tree. And as a result, we're getting that dieback in the center. All right, here's another one. Squirrel damage left this magnolia tree looking uneven with broken branches. Our goal was to bring it back to shape. It looks like they didn't do too bad a job here. Again, it looks thinner, doesn't it? And again, don't prune in the interior of the tree unless absolutely necessary. I I should have put a picture. I had a tree, a maple tree, where in Indiana, where every inch of bark was stripped off of that tree, and eventually died. But those tree rats can be damaging. Um, and I'm not sure what happened as far as how much they had to remove it. The interior branches might have been damaged, but again, the instructive point here is that again, a lot of interior branches removed, and did they have to be? So you can see where obviously this looks a lot thinner. There's large aspect ratio branches here that could have been brought down and try. This looks like a great candidate for creating a central leader. It comes here and then it goes into thirds here and here. Reduce reduce here, and allow this guy to get bigger and create that dominant leader. That would have been a great structural pruning for this particular tree. All right, here's a Shade Master honey locust. Always a lot of dead wood in these to prune, and also a lot of crossing, fixing some old stubs, broken limbs, and so forth, and keeping the low one for a swing. You can see here that again, it looks like mostly smaller interior branches were pruned here, as opposed to again fixing these large aspect ratio. You can see almost all the branches are the same. We got this big cluster down here. So this is where we could reduce some of these and try to select a leader and get rid of some of these. See right here where there's a 1-to-1. So this would be where you would reduce one of these branches to a lateral. Same with these over here. Reduce, there's a codominant here, or large aspect ratio. We can reduce one and allow the other one to proliferate. So think in terms of aspect ratio when you're deciding on how to do your end weight reduction and do your structural pruning. Um, Here's another one, same thing. We got a codominant leader. I like this because their primary goal is to fix the codominance and improve clearance. And you can see the density of the crown is pretty similar. So nice job here in not removing too many of those interiors in order to accomplish those objectives. So great. They didn't do any shaping, no shearing. It just basically let the tree grow to its natural form and improve structure by removing that codominant. And the same with this one. Now this is the last one as far as pruning projects. So this oak was topped. Yeah, you can see it right through here, man. It's like, oh crap, all of this is epicormic sprouting. So now it's about managing sprouts. And I'm not sure what was done after because it looks like it's a little less dense, but you still have a ton of sprouts. And i- again, it's about managing those sprouts. My guess is they're probably going back. He said that 30% of the wood was taken from the tree. So my guess is they're going to have to go back after a year or two or a season or two and do a little additional pruning to manage those sprouts. Because you can see there's still a bunch of them up there. And mitigating topping and storm damage is really a challenge. And I want to talk a little bit about that to close out here. But I want to check in with Kale to see if there's any burning questions while we're on this topic.
I do have quite a few questions here. Um, but yeah, if you'd like to finish off with this, then we can get into them. They're more
Yeah,
broad
yeah,
topics.
yeah. I'll go. I got just a few more slides here, and actually this comes back to the topping and then also storm recovery. So this is a great slide that I want to take a picture or screenshot of it. This is about managing top trees and storm damaged trees. So this tree was in Texas, and Brenda and I were teaching some pruning actually in that area, and a tornado went through shortly before we got there, and we were looking at the damage. And one of the things about topping and storm damage often mimic each other in the fact that usually it's the outer broken branches that, and then once they're broken, you have that truncated branch and proliferation of sprouts. So we use what we call the 1/3 strategy. Um, First of all, we want to develop a new leader on each of those first order branches. And then we're managing the sprouts by the 1/3 rule. So basically you remove a third of the sprouts that are, especially those that are competing with that new first order or that first order branch, reduce a third back to a suitable lateral if possible, and then just leave a third alone and space them out along the branch if possible. So you might want to thin some of them out, especially if you have a ton of them starting to come up because the tree's got a lot of resources that it's used to feeding, but because the branches have been cut, it's going to throw those dormant latent buds into frenzy and start coming out. But one thing you got to do is be patient with this, and it takes multiple pruning sessions in order to really get that structure back into shape. And as Ryan mentioned earlier, those sprouts can develop into strong attachments if you manage the remaining sprouts appropriately. So the idea here again is to thin, leave a third alone, and then reduce a third. So uh, kind of finishing out with mature tree pruning. Again, we want to make sure that we're just doing only what is necessary to improve structure and reduce the likelihood of failure. There should not be a lot of pruning on these large uh, veteran trees, especially. The only thing we need to do is manage loads and make sure that we're doing peripheral pruning for clearance as needed. That's basically it. And then making sure that we don't do any interior pruning, especially on those older trees, because those are the prime economy for that tree. So, our whole goal here is to identify those conditions of concern, which we went through, and implement some kind of sensible mitigation option. Hopefully, pruning accomplishes that. Structural supports may be necessary in some situations, but hopefully, pruning can manage that. And I'd like to throw a prop out there to the prescription pruning qualification that the Florida ISA chapter has developed. Um, um, I was on that writing committee led by Dr. Gilman that talks about the prescription pruning qualification. It's a credential that is just teaches you basically the a new perspective on pruning and how to really write specifications and basically get what you want for pruning, which is often what's lacking. I know as a sales arborist, one of the most challenging things was selling the tree. I knew what needed to be pruned. Try to through charades and pointing and describing what to prune, and then when I go back to check it, it's like, ah, man, they didn't get it. And then you have to either go back or I would finish the pruning project myself. But again, this is a new language on how to prescribe pruning that gets the best results. So that's where um, that's where it's at. If you're interested in that, email me. I can give you some information and actually some. Um, I actually talked about this at the TCI Expo. If any of you were there, that is recorded and available on TCI's website that introduces this pruning credential. So this is the book, and this is the QR code that takes you to Amazon right now if you want to get a preview of that to see what's in the book. If you have any questions that you want to throw at me or comments or discussions, be happy to talk about that. Just send me an email or give me a call. And I can always talk about pruning. So with that, Kale, handing off to you, buddy.
Yep, I've got a couple here. Um, Regarding fruit-bearing trees, is there evidence to support removing interior branches to allow air movement through the canopy to suppress pests and diseases?
Uh, Fruit tree pruning is a whole different thing here because we're actually pruning to improve that fruiting and production. And a lot of that has to do not necessarily with the structure of the tree, but the number of leaves in relationship to the fruits and flowers so that we can get not just fruit, but get good quality fruit, especially when we're talking about apple trees. You see a tree that's really dense apple trees and has a ton of apples on it, but they're little tiny crab apples basically, and that's the result of just having too much fruit and not enough, and not reducing those flowers and reducing those branches that produce those. So that's a whole different type of subject that requires different type of pruning.
Okay. I also have. What is your opinion on tree growth regulators for the maintenance of pruned trees?
Ooh, I don't think tree growth regulators are used near enough. Um, it does a couple of good things. I did a trial with paclibutrazol on Purdue campus. It reduced our pruning tremendously because what it does, paclibutrazol is actually a failed fungicide. It's in the same family as like propiconazole, tebuconazole. It's in the azole family, and it sucked as a fungicide. But what they found out was it does suppress growth by thickening the cells and actually making making the leaves greener. And also, it improves drought resistance, which is what we were primarily testing. So about 10 years ago, we had a legacy drought. Well, that seems to be more frequent now, but it reduced our watering requirements by almost 2/3. So and also it reduces the number of times you have to visit that tree, especially from a vegetation management perspective, and the fact that they don't their cycles are reduced as a result of using growth regulators. So yeah, thumbs up to those. It's great for the tree biologically and from a management perspective.
I have here. Do you ever thin the crown to allow the lower scaffolding branches to thrive and not be shade cast?
I never thin the crown for any reason. Um, period. If the branches don't need to be thin to improve their growth or their health. Trees have been around a long time and kind of know how to manage that stuff. Um, there was once thought that by opening up the crown, you can get more airflow and more light. Yeah, you're going to get that, but again, if you're removing those interior branches, you're creating a vulnerable tree, biologically and mechanically. So, really, I can't see any reason why you would want to thin a crown at all.
We've talked a lot about the 1/3 rule, using fractions to talk about um, pruning. Is there a specific size that you start to worry about um, when you're cutting branches for like a certain diameter that seems like you're getting too large for a removal cut, when you're talking about creating decay and things like that?
Yeah, I talk a lot about that in the book. It explains it pretty well, and the fact that you know, basically, we're talking about the tree's ability to compartmentalize and close that wound, and that's depending largely upon the ratio of heartwood to sapwood. Once you start pruning and you start, and I do this a lot, was I start pruning and I'll look at the branch cut. And if I'm seeing, as I go back, I'll start out, I may make 2 or 3 cuts on the same branch. But as the heartwood starts to enlarge or the wound induced colored wood starts enlarging, what I'll stop pruning because the more heartwood, the more that increases your likelihood of decay. So sapwood is what creates that occlusion. So as you start going through there, you want to look to how much heartwood is actually being exposed. And the tree's ability to compartmentalize is based on 3 things. One is genetic capacity. Some are just good compartmentalizers and some are just weak. Environmental conditions, as far as especially water availability, and third is the time. How much time is it going to take for that wound to occlude? So I always like to take the tree's temperature by looking at the tree's growth increments to determine how aggressive I can be there. So if it has the time, genetic capacity, and a good growing and healthy tree, then the tree is going to withstand that wounding a little better, if you will. But again, you want to look at the amount of sapwood in relationship to the heartwood to give you kind of a better idea of how quickly that wound is going to close.
Arturo Corona asked, when you need to do reduction on overextended large branches on very large trees over structures, for instance, when insurance companies get involved, what are your recommendations there?
Do only what is needed to make them happy. Like I said, trees are often put in the wrong places, and we got to clean up the mess and make them urban compatible. So you just prune only what you got to do in order to satisfy the needs of the client. That's unfortunately that's first. Being an advocate for the trees, we're saying, oh no, we can't do that. It's going to lead to a huge wound. Well, you got to do the best you can to bring it back to a proper lateral or a heading cut in order to satisfy those objectives. And that's the best we can do. I realize it's not ideal, but we've got to make them urban compatible and satisfy those client objectives.
Um, Taylor Siegler asked about that last tree, the one that was was topped years before. Is there ever a situation where you would be removing entire branches back to the trunk?
On these, it depends on the size. T- Most, I'd say 90% of the time, I don't make any trunk cuts. Usually you can find a suitable lateral. Reduction cuts are by far the best cut for the tree. Um, the only time you'd make a removal cut on a branch is honestly, it's about clearance. And sometimes you can't get to a lateral, but you may need a heading cut. So it's very situational. But like on these, no, I wouldn't. If I remove a branch, I'm basically just taking away that tree's ability to recover from that topping and change the form dramatically. And that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is manage those sprouts so that we don't alter the natural form of that tree, as you can see here where it was once growing, but start thinking about managing it structurally, so that it can have a more, um, I guess, stable structure.
Okay. I think I have two more here. Planting. So after planting a tree, about how long are you waiting until you start doing your structural pruning to develop those proper leaders?
I do it before it even goes in the ground. It's a lot easier to prune the tree. You know, you got a 12-foot tree, 3-inch caliper. If it's laying on the ground, you can not spot a codominant and get rid of one of them, make that cut. But I was city forester in Indianapolis for several years, and one of our goals with our department and also the not-for-profits that we work with that did a lot of tree planting. Our goal was to plant the tree, make any cuts we needed to, like broken branches or crossing branches, but also, if we had that slingshot, we would reduce one of those or remove it in order to get that structure because we didn't know if we were going to get back there again. But our goal was if we is to prune it structurally at a minimum at planting and then try to revisit it within 5 to 7 years to start establishing those temporary branches, reducing those back, and allowing encouraging those permanent branches higher in the crown to start developing and outpacing those. So you can start at planting. There's nothing wrong with that.
Perfect. Last one. Do you have to live in or be a part of Florida ISA to get the prescriptive pruning credential?
No, actually, we're starting to move that out of state. Ed and I will be teaching that course in Memphis at the Southern Chapter Conference in April, early April. Ed and I will be teaching that course in Indiana the third week of April. And he's been in California with another instructor, but we've got there's other states and other chapters starting to hold that course. So check the Florida ISA website for schedule of those events. There's one in Tallahassee coming up in first week of December. I think that's the next one, but we're starting to schedule more of those.
Perfect. Um, the last thing I believe that we have to do, actually, two last things. One, I have posted the link to the quiz in the comments section. Once this is done, I'll post it in the description as well. So go ahead and head out to take that. If you're watching in the future, maybe about 24, 48 hours from now, the quiz will still be available. It will be worth 1 CEU. Right now it's worth 2. The other thing is that our raffle winners off of Facebook, it looks like it's going to be Irina Suiki. And off of YouTube, it's Chris Hobner. So Irina and Chris are going to be receiving a copy of there it is, Arboricultural Practices, Science-Based Approach by Lindsey Purcell. So
I'm ready to mail it.
Perfect. Great. So I will be contacting you in a couple moments here. Lindsey, once again, thank you very much for doing this.
One last
great
thing.
webinar. Yes.
And I mentioned it earlier, but one of the things about Rate My Prune is it's not personal, and I'll critique it, not criticize it. And it's also when I used to manage crews, I don't criticize the performer, I criticize the performance, and that's all anybody should do. And what I'm doing is we all have a general interest in trees and making them be long-lived structures, and just trying to make us better in our industry. And hopefully, I didn't offend anybody. Certainly wasn't my intentions. My intentions is to make you a better professional. I just wanted to close with that because sometimes people get a little upset about those criticisms, but believe me, it's for the better.
Of course. Yes, and make sure that everybody goes out and you do your judging thing every month. treestuff.com/rate my prune. Yep. And if you have any prunes that you would like to be roasted, go ahead and send those in to media@treestuff.com. So thanks for watching. And once again, thank you very much, Lindsey, for doing this for us.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, guys.